So, John chapter 18, a very familiar passage. It's the passage where Jesus is arrested. And sometimes I think because passages are very familiar, we can gloss over them a little bit and miss the small details and the impact of them. But just see if something stands out to you as I read it. Or shall I wait for it to come on the screen? From verse 1 to 11 I'm reading. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was an olive grove, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the grove guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. And Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you that I am he," Jesus answered. "If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" What a passage. If you were to watch a film, often they have that passage in there because it's so emotive. It's so colourful. It's got so much context in it. And I hope that today that we will perhaps have a different perspective as well, so that we can face whatever it is that God puts before us, as Jesus faced whatever it was that was before him. Because we have a victorious gospel, a victorious message. We don't have a message of defeat. We have a message of victory, a message of hope, a message of a future. Good news, it's called. Ours is good news of victory, of triumph over sin and death. Hallelujah. There's no story like it, and there never has been. Never will there ever be one as powerful as the message that we have, the good news that Jesus is alive today. But he did have to go through some difficult times. In fact, things weren't looking very good for him at all there. Not at all. Picture it. They'd just come from the upper room. We'd had the Last Supper, the betrayal. We'd had Peter's realizing that he's going to betray Jesus and kind of denying that as well. They've taken a little walk down the hill, up the hill in the Kidron Valley. They get to this grove that we call the Garden of Gethsemane now. And John doesn't say it, but Jesus had been praying. He's in anguish. And then there's this detachment of soldiers that come. Now, the word detachment actually, in its own way, says that there was quite a number of soldiers. Whenever you see it on the films, or if you've seen it in a picture, I don't know what your image is, you might have, Jesus with the disciples and perhaps another dozen soldiers with lamps and some torches. Or you might have, maybe more than that, 15, 20. But a detachment of soldiers is 1/10 of a legion, and a legion was 600 soldiers. So a legion was 6,000 soldiers, so a detachment could be as many as 600. I'm not saying there were 600 there, but they would have had a considerable force because they had a plan. The plan was to go and arrest Jesus, to make sure that nobody escaped. So they would have also had the plan to make sure that if anybody started running, they would chase them and chase them down. It wasn't looking good for Jesus at this point. Not only did they have a detachment of a considerable force, a considerable number, the people that he were opposed to also had a plan against him. And the place where they were wasn't as though it was fortified with towers and big walls and gates that they would have found it hard to get through. The detachment just walked straight in. And what does Jesus do? He stays there. On the face of it, Jesus wasn't looking in the best of shape. On his side, he had 11 disciples. Maybe there were a couple of others there with him, we're not exactly sure. And potentially just one sword. The odds would have been overwhelming. But at that point, history was changing. It looked terrible, but history was changing. Changing for the world. Most people would have perhaps been tempted to slip away. Hide behind a tree, climb a tree. Just let the others deal with it. Look, I'll tell you what, I'm going to go over there. You go and sort them out. Tell them you don't know where I am. And then by the time they realise I'm not with you, I'll be gone. He could have said that. He could have tried to escape. Absolutely the opposite. He faced up to what was happening. It's very human for us to make decisions that are best in our interest. And from what looks like a human point of view, Jesus was making all the wrong decisions, and the army, the detachment, was making all the right decisions. They came with power. They came with force. They came with a well-connected group of people, the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees. They had friends in high places. They had a considerable amount of gravity with them. Jesus, well, he had 12 guys that weren't well connected at all, that weren't trained physically, apart from perhaps Simon the Zealot. They might have been strong at fishing, but they weren't trained as soldiers by any means. And this effective, impressive force looked like it was going to overwhelm them. Jesus doesn't run away for one simple reason, he is completely obedient to the Father. He says to Peter, about the cup. And I kind of pause at this point because I'm thinking about what this cup means. When Jesus says, "Shall I not drink the cup that the Father gives me?" This isn't just a normal cup. We're talking about the cup of God's wrath. This cup, which is dreadful and terrible. In fact, if you were to add up all the calamities in the world and all the disasters in all of history, they wouldn't equal one sip from the cup of God's wrath. And Jesus says to Peter, "Are you expecting me really not to do what the Father wants and drink this cup of wrath?" It is astonishing that he would say that. His desire is complete obedience to the Father. How many of us, when we face hard times, would say something like that? I'm looking forward to seeing how God will use this hard time. Whenever you're facing a time of difficulty, what do you say? What's the quickest way out of it? Or do you say, I'm going to stick through this time and drink this cup that God has put before me and trust that he will make good come out of it? It's a very, very human thing to want to flee. It's a very godly thing to want to be obedient to the Father as Jesus is. Peter certainly didn't understand what was going on. He was wrapped up in human decisions and perspective. His response was, what's the best way out of this? I know, I'll attack him with my sword. Duh, duh, duh. Him against would have been dozens and dozens, I suppose, of soldiers. What is he doing? What is he thinking? What's the best way out? Maybe he thought, well, what's the odds? 5-1. Well, at least I'll take one of them down. Was that what he was thinking? Really? And he makes this wild swing at Malchus, probably trying to cut off his head, but totally missing and cutting off his ear instead. He's thinking, perhaps, what authority have they got? I'm with Jesus, the Son of God, the ruler of creation. What authority do they think they have? How many times do we as Christians fall into that trap of thinking, I'm above the law because I'm with Jesus? We are absolutely not above the law. Absolutely not. Just because it doesn't say in the Bible that it's wrong to take Class A drugs doesn't mean that you can go and do that. Just because it doesn't say in the Bible about cars doesn't mean that you can speed at extraordinary speeds that are dangerous. We are not above the law as Christians. Doesn't matter whose authority that we come under. We need to pay our taxes. We need to be honest and not steal and do the things that are obviously not right. We shouldn't do them. We are not above the law, even though the authority that we bow down to is the highest authority. Perhaps Simon Peter was trying to prove something. He'd just been told by Jesus that he was going to betray him. Perhaps he's making a point. I'm not going to betray you, Jesus. See, I'm the one standing up for you. I'm the one that's being the bravest. I'm not going to betray you. Little did he know. When Jesus says something, it always comes true. We don't always understand it. That's why prophecy is so difficult. It's always difficult to understand because we don't think like Jesus thinks. Jesus' purpose is to face whatever God puts before him, to be obedient to the Father's will. Why is that important for us to realize his example? It's because we usually put other criteria before our decisions, don't we? We don't put what God wants, we put what we want. We ask ourselves, well, how much is that going to cost me? Coming to church, how much is that going to cost me? Buying somebody a present, how much is that going to cost me? We put our criteria before God's criteria. We might even say, how's this going to affect my children? How's this going to affect the ones I love? Is this going to make my life easier or harder? Is this going to make my life better or worse? We have the criteria of how much time will this take? Because we live such busy lives, how much time have we got? Now, none of those criteria are completely wrong. Don't misunderstand me. They're not wrong. They're not irrelevant. But it's not necessarily what Jesus would do, what his priorities are. When we make decisions, we could put them in the perspective of, is it best to do this out of forgiveness and love? Our priorities could be, will this allow me to read my Bible more or less? Our priorities could be, well, should I really be watching these images on the screen? Are they helpful or not? Our priorities could be, is this a good work that I'm doing? Sometimes God puts a good thought into your mind, doesn't he? If we did that good thought every time God did that, wouldn't the world be a much better place? How many times have we had good thoughts and not actually followed through with them? We were talking earlier about good intentions, and I think I've mentioned it before. My mum used to say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. If we did every good thing that God put on our heart, the world would be a better place. We would be running in God's direction as we did that. We often use excuses like, well, what might happen? If I did that, what might happen? Looking at the worst situation in order to avoid doing something that is good. We often use what might happen in order to ignore the direction that God is taking us into. Because the what might happen could be something bad. But just Jesus avoid what was bad when he was in Gethsemane? He didn't. Because he wanted to fulfill what the Father's will was. He was less dependent on what people thought, less dependent on what people's expectations were. Why is this also important for us? It's because the gospel of Jesus Christ is different to the gospel of the world. The gospel of Jesus says, love those who hate you. Show mercy to those who hurt you. Forgive those who harm you. Where money is not a priority in the gospel of Jesus, but trusting God is a priority. where we are to look towards goodness and not badness. The gospel says that you can't earn your salvation. It's impossible to earn salvation. It's a gift given by Jesus to us. And it's not worth trading your soul for the victorious gospel. It's not worth trading your soul for anything other than faith in Jesus, giving your life to him. Why make a big deal of all of this? Well, because as Christians, we often live like the world for 6 days a week, and we act like the gospel of the world is very similar to that of Jesus. But it's not. Jesus' gospel is not similar to the world's gospel. The way that the world does things is different to the way that Jesus does things. And what our priorities are should be in line with what Jesus' priorities are. To glorify the Father, first and foremost, above all other things. Put him first. God's ways are not our ways. In Isaiah 55, he says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. His ways are higher than ours. So which kingdom are you living for? Are you living for the gospel of the world, or are you living for the gospel of victory in Jesus? Jesus says that phrase, I am he. Ego eimi, it is in Greek. And lots of translations have the he in italics because in the Greek it only says that I am. And he says it 3 times in this passage, I am. It's not wrong that the NIV puts it in with a he because it gives the message across. It's right. However, Jesus is, when he's saying that, making a reference. I am, he declares in John 8. Before Abraham was born, I am, he says. He also makes a reference that we can hear and echo back to Exodus 3, when Moses was in front of the burning bush and asked the name of the Father. He says, I am. And when the detachment of soldiers come up to him and he says that, they fall back. Why is that? Well, I think that they were shocked. It was a shock to them. They were expecting a fight. And lo and behold, the one that they were looking for actually comes straight up to them. And they kind of like stand back. And maybe there was a crowd there. And as they stood back, they tripped over each other. Maybe they stood back because the person that was in charge was going to come through and arrest them. But as they stand back, they kind of like trip and they stumble and they fall to the ground. They stand up again. And he says, I am. I'm who you're looking for. Let these other ones go. Accidentally, the soldiers show how victorious the gospel is. Inadvertently, the world is obedient to God, even though they don't realize it. Perhaps the plants that are grown by the gardeners sprout without realizing the glory that they are showing to God in creation. The Lord is in control of all things. There is nothing outside of his control. including our destiny for those who believe in him. And it is difficult, I know, when we're facing hard times to not run away from them. But Jesus can make good come out of bad. Even though the weather isn't fantastic all the time, God can make good come out of bad for that. Even though you might have been getting fed up with something in your life, whatever it is, God can make good come out of that. We don't have to run away from bad things. We have to run towards what God's will is. And sometimes God's will is for us to go through difficult times in order to face the glory that he has before us. And difficult times take many shapes and forms. They can be loss. Loss in relationships, loss in work, many difficult things we could face in the world. But God says, go through them, I'm with you. And when we do go through the difficult times with God, we get the reward afterwards, that lovely ability to know his presence with us, that assurance of our salvation. Sometimes people meet God in the valley of life. That's often where people meet with God and get converted, in the valley. It's not unusual for that to happen. For me, it was on the mountaintop. I was having a great time. My life was great. I didn't realize it could get any better, and it did. I met with Jesus. I want to encourage you, my dear brothers and sisters, don't shy away from what God is leading you into. Even if it seems difficult and dark and bleak, trust him. He will be with you. He will use it for his glory, and you will be blessed at the same time. I haven't written any questions down. But perhaps on your table, or you might want to swap tables, I don't know, you could discuss a time that you have felt God lead you into, that on the face of it didn't look very good, but you knew it was God's will for you to do it, or to go through it. Some things you have to go through that aren't easy. Maybe you can discuss that as it was God's will for you to do it.